All right. Welcome to Another Perspective. I'm Kristen Nutter, your host, and I have the honor of having my own sweet dad on today, Steve Nutter.
Hello.
Um, and I'm just so excited. I've been bringing on some different guests, and I have other people in mind. And so far, people have just kind of been telling their stories and talking about why they believe what they believe and why it's important to them. And I wanted to bring my dad on because he has a very compelling story, and I think you'll find it fascinating. I think you'll find it that who he is today is such an interesting byproduct of what has happened and transpired in the years of his life to bring him to this point, and I get to be the beneficiary of being his daughter. So, hi, Dad.
Hi, Kristen. What a pleasure to be here today.
This is so fun. Oh my goodness. Well, Dad, what's it like being my dad?
Well, it really is truly a joy, just a great joy to my heart. And Mom and we just thank God daily for the privilege of having two wonderful daughters, Kristen and Sarah, and just the blessing of the Lord. We thank God for you every day.
See what I mean? Isn't he just so dear, so precious? I have such a good dad. I'm so blessed. And I want to share him with you. So, Dad, as your daughter, I can say, a lot of people ask me, how did you turn out the way that you did? Or what is it that your parents did to bring you to who you are today? And I love getting that question, and I love answering that question because I get to explain to people that you and Mom are some of the most authentic people between your private and your public life that I know. And I got to bear witness to that over the course of my life from childhood on. I think that anyone who knows you could completely, with their whole life, trust you. They could trust your integrity. They could trust that you're going to do what you say you're going to do, that you really mean what you say, and that you live by your beliefs as much as possible. And that kind of a person is so refreshing in this world. I think we can all agree. And I happen to be raised by people like that. And it's interesting because I know that you and Mom, neither of you were raised in a Christian home, and both of you had very different upbringings from one another. And I want to hear a little more about, well, just Dad, tell me what life was like growing up. You grew up in Parkersburg, West Virginia, small town West Virginia. And yeah, what was Steve Nutter's childhood like?
It was a lot of positives and a lot of negatives. It's an unusual story, but I guess I'd want to preface it by just a couple of things. One is my story does have some unusual turns to it, but everybody has a story, and that story is equally valuable and equally important. And God helps us write that story. We want to write that story and follow that story for His honor and glory. But there are some unique turns to it. Also, I'll share some things that were dramatic in my life, but I genuinely thank God for His watch, care, and protection over me in the course of that, and for my brothers and sisters as well. But I'll be glad to start and kind of let you know, or let the audience know a bit about kind of my background, if you'd like.
Yeah, Dad, feel free to dig as deep as you want. I'm going to ask follow-up questions. What's nice is I already know this story, so I'm going to just pretend to be listening actively, but I've heard all this before, but I do want to I want to mine some of the depths of that. I might ask follow-up questions, and um I want you to feel free to share whatever you feel comfortable sharing, and also filter as you need to, whatever feels appropriate. We can also give people a heads up if you decide to go really for it.
Okay.
So,
Fair enough.
okay,
And feel free to interrupt me anytime if you want to have me
I
elaborate on
will.
something. That would be great. So, yeah, I was born and raised in Parkersburg, West Virginia, mid 1950s. Came from a very poor home. We lived. My father worked as an entry level lab technician at Union Carbide, a factory, a chemical factory on the Ohio River. So it didn't have a lot of training. There wasn't a lot of room for advancement. It was just a very low paying job. We spent years on welfare and food stamps and that sort of thing. We didn't go to regular department stores. We went to thrift stores and secondhand stores to get clothing and shoes. We would wear out our shoes to where there was a hole in the bottom, and then there was a hole in your sock, and then there was a blister on the bottom of your feet, and then you get baseball cards and put 3 or 4 of those in there for another week or two, and then that would go on for a while till finally we could make it to the thrift store to get another pair of somebody else's used shoes. And we didn't know any different and didn't care. It was just life, and I think our end of town was poor anyway, so it was just life for us, and it never affected us, or it didn't cause us to skip a beat in terms of just enjoying childhood. And there were a lot of things about my childhood that were very enjoyable. I lived right on the edge of town near some woods. I could play in the woods with my friends and play in the creek or climb the mountains or the foothills of Appalachia, and just loved that. I had a bike that I rode up into the hills and stuff. It was a lot of fun. I did a lot of caving or spelunking in non-commercial undeveloped caves, just getting all grungy and stuff, crawling through these who knows where and trying to come out alive kind of thing. But it was, so a lot of it was a lot of adventure and a lot of fun. Home life was the challenge. My parents, very early on in their marriage, they had to get married. My mom was pregnant with my older brother.
And she was about how old? Both your parents, what were their ages?
She was 17, I think, and my dad was 9 years older, so he was 26, right? He'd spent a little bit of time in the military. And
your mom, just to give some extra backstory, she ran away from home.
She came from a very troubled, a very difficult home. Her mom died at birth, giving birth to my mom, and then her dad abandoned her and headed off to Indianapolis to start a new family, and left my mom behind in the care of a grandfather who was an alcoholic. And my mom has lots of stories of cleaning up his vomit and that kind of thing, and just difficult relatives that were abusive toward her. And but she was very smart, very gifted, and very hardworking. She met my dad. They fell in love, and they got pregnant and had to get married. Both families rejected them. They fled to Florida, where my dad got tuberculosis and it was very difficult. They made their way back to Parkersburg and got this job, entry-level job. But it was a level of poor where our poor neighbors would bring bags of groceries and set them on the porch of our house, just for us to have enough to eat. There were 5 kids. I was second oldest.
And your dad, tell me about your dad really quick. First of all, he was adopted, and our last name, had he not been adopted, would be
Anderson.
Yeah.
He was an Anderson out of New Jersey. But she wasn't able to keep the child. So the child ended up actually being raised for the first several months by the University of West Virginia home ec department. So the girls would take turns caring for my dad, feeding him, changing diapers and that stuff during the first several months of his life, until the Nutters adopted him.
So he was a college class project.
He really was. He was a college class project, and his baby photo is on the cover of the yearbook for the West Virginia University yearbook that year. It was just
wild.
Very unusual.
I'm sure he could have been a study in human development.
Yes, he could have. Yeah. So he was adopted, and I think he struggled with not feeling loved by his birth parents. And my dad developed a lot of emotional issues and challenges, maybe that started from that, but other things as well that became more serious. But he and my mom got married, had 5 kids in pretty quick order. It was pretty early on in the marriage where they really began to hate each other, and most of my early childhood memories are lots of fighting, lots of yelling, throwing pots and pans at each other, shoving each other up and down the stairs, just really. I mean, police being called on them, that kind of thing. It was not a healthy situation by any stretch. So my brothers and sisters and I found escape, if you will, through lots of other outlets. Playing outside with our friends, late at night games and stuff. We could roam the streets till late at night because it was a very safe place to grow up. We had weekend long Monopoly games. We got involved in the Boy Scouts. We pursued academics in school, and we all played musical instruments. I played trumpet for a lot of years in the orchestra at high school, and those were outlets that got us out of the home and got us around other healthier people, if you will. So, but mom and dad were troubled, and the marriage was very dysfunctional. We didn't see a lot of love in the home, but we found affirmation and care from them, certainly, but also outside the home as well. That was helpful. Um, so, in the midst of that conflict, the sheriff's department had at one point heard about my dad, had heard some rumors that he might be dangerous. So my dad was in an explosion at the plant where he worked. A boiler blew up, and he was on the fire detail, and saw in the explosion, he saw a friend or two of his die in that, and he had some damage to his eyes, was in the hospital for a long time. We weren't sure if he was going to regain his sight, but he did. But he struggled after that emotionally in going back to work and being a stable employee. And not long after that, the kind of rumors about my dad had made their way to the local sheriff's department, and they'd been told some stories about my dad that I think were made up, honestly. But I remember one Saturday morning, I was maybe 10 or 11, and I'm talking with my dad in our living room, which was unusual because my dad really had to work a lot of double shifts. So he would work 16 hours a day. If anybody had a shift they didn't want, my dad would try to pick that up just to be able to put food on the table. He really struggled to try to provide, and it was a struggle. Um, but he was home this one Saturday morning, and so my dad and I were having an unusual but very pleasant conversation that I still remember. And then all of a sudden, I noticed out the front window of the house 4 or 5 police cars coming down our little street, and then a bunch of armed policemen, full uniform with guns raised, surrounding our house, which never had happened before. And then immediately the sheriff came in, or a police officer came in, and he knew my dad. They spoke briefly, and then they hauled my dad away. And for a little kid, this was, obviously very disturbing. And then from there, he was taken to a state mental hospital where he spent the next 2 years. I think my mom tried to have him committed, but that didn't work out, which is a good thing that it didn't. But nonetheless, he was taken to a state mental hospital, which in the late 1960s in West Virginia, so just think about the horror movies you've seen of mental hospitals. This would be that. He could have written books about the just tragic, horrible things that he saw happening. But he was released, and when he got out, there was already a court-ordered separation. So all of his in the marriage, so all of his possessions were out on the street curb, literally, and so he had to get all that stuff and found an apartment in town. And then, so we were now mostly with my mom. There was some visitation back and forth that happened.
Yeah, what was going on while your dad was gone?
So my mom at this point, with dad in the mental institution, we had a lot of bookshelves and lots of books in our home, but many of them were a lot of Eastern mysticism books. My mom really loved Eastern mysticism and different religions from the East, and so she would read a lot of those, and then she began posting little sayings on the mirrors of the house, on the windows and stuff. So you'd have these taped on little sayings that would reflect Eastern doctrine or Eastern beliefs. And then once the separation occurred, and then my dad committed some actions that were harmful to children, and the kind of thing where you would go to prison for, and he should have, but he didn't, because the sheriff talked my mom into not pressing charges. And because it was back then, there wasn't much in the way of shielding the victims, and so names would be in the newspaper, that sort of thing. But he should have paid his debt to society, but he really did not. But it did mean that the divorce was finalized, and my dad lost all visitation rights, and so dad was out of our home and out of our lives for the next several years. So we're living with mom, and she's a single mom, very admirably working very hard to provide for raising for 5 kids that are growing up and needing food and, a roof over their heads, and she really did amazing at that. But again, financial struggles, that kind of thing. It was, lots of work on her part and scrimping by, but I deeply admire her for that. But at the same time, her religious views became more pronounced, where in moving she kind of moved from the Eastern mysticism to deeper into occult practices. And so there began to be in our home, kind of with dad out of the picture now, there began to be in our home things like seances and palm readings and tarot cards and those sort of things. And my brothers and sisters and I always thought that was odd. None of us were religious. We didn't go to church. My mom, honestly, at the time, hated Christianity, hated Christians, hated church, and she worked hard to keep us out of that, even though some of our Boy Scout troops met in buildings that were supplied by churches, but we never attended those churches. Nonetheless, she became more and more outwardly involved in these things. So my brothers and sisters and I simply went to our friend's house to play Monopoly or to study or whatever. We just, it was not that we felt unsafe. We felt this is weird and it's not for us.
You want to get out of the house.
Yeah. We wanted out of there. So, so we found other places to go to, stay late after school, that kind of stuff, band practice, orchestra, whatever. And then it got to where it really took a turn into witchcraft. I don't know that mom would call it that, but when you get into actually putting spells and hexes on people, then you've crossed a line there where you actually are engaged in a witchcraft kind of practice. And it actually is through that I came to Christ, that I met Christ, oddly enough. So I was in 10th grade at this point, and there was a guy who was a senior in high school, a guy named Mark. And Mark was the most bizarre person I'd ever met. He looked weird, acted weird. He really looked like a dangerous, at least for a little Parkersburg, West Virginia, looked like a dangerous person back then. And
like, what does that mean?
He just seemed not just the dress and appearance, but the very demeanor of the person.
Like a dark
was
figure
very
type.
dark and scary to the rest of us. You just didn't want to hang around Mark. People avoided Mark. And don't know how this happened, but he and my mom made a connection somehow. And he would come over to our house, and they would talk occult shop. I guess what we would call today occult best practices. I don't know, but
I don't know.
Yeah, and don't need to know. But they would sort of hone their skills or talk about things that they were learning or developing their skills, whatever. And Mark was involved in witchcraft and a coven and that sort of thing. And not that Parkersburg was known for that; it wasn't. But whatever there was there, Mark and my mom were involved in it. And so this happened several times. And so again, we're heading to our neighbors' homes, whatever.
Like, Mark's coming.
Yeah, exactly. Got to go. And one day, his life changed. I mean, it changed, and it was dramatic and palpable. And I thought, what did that? What made that change? It was shocking. It was stunning. And so one day I asked him, what happened? What's going on? And he said, well, come with me to church. And so we hadn't gone to church. I didn't know much about church, but I went on a Sunday night. It was a youth group type meeting, and like a Young Life or Youth for Christ, if you know about it, those organizations in high school ministry. About a dozen kids or so, and a guy playing guitar, singing some songs and giving a little lesson. And they had a little bucket that was for an offering, and they would pass that around. And, so it's early 1970s, think, 60s thinking, and then kind of the Jesus revolution and all. So with this offering going around, you could put in an offering or take out if you had a need.
Wow.
It's just a
cool.
different kind of way of thinking. But there was this group of kids, it was something very different about them. And so after it was over, 3 or 4 of them came up and began talking with me and sharing little gospel tracts about what Christ did on the cross to pay for my sins. And this was something I'd never heard. I knew the name Jesus, of course, because raised in America, I see churches on street corners, but I had no clue. Honestly, I had no clue what he had done for me in dying for my sins. And I was a good kid, as you might humanly define good. I was a very straight-laced kid. I wasn't I wasn't involved in anything
Yeah,
nefarious.
your reaction to your home life was pendulum swing into being a really good person.
I really tried to be, right.
Yeah.
And I found a lot of affirmation from teachers and scout leaders and stuff. My brother was an Eagle Scout. I was an Eagle Scout, and loved that. And that was very meaningful to us and very informative and shaping in our lives. But I knew immediately as they shared this with me that I was in that category, that I was a sinner, that I had done things that were offensive to God, just thoughts, attitudes, things I'd say, whatever. It was easy. I just was convicted. I knew in that moment clearly, if God is holy, I am not.
Mm.
And that I needed to place my trust in Christ who died for me. And so that night I prayed. It was June 2nd, 1972. I'll never forget. I remember sitting in the very back pew there. Evening church was over there, turning out the lights in the place. And I'm sitting in the back pew and just praying and trusting in Jesus who died for me and rose again. And they didn't invite me back. I think they thought I knew to come back, but we weren't raised in church, so I didn't know that you're supposed to repeat this. But they gave me a Bible, a Bible to read, and said, "Here, read this." And I thought, oh, this is like the instruction manual. This is the operator's manual for the Christian life. Read this. It was early June, beginning of summer, so I had no summer school and no job, and so I'm reading hours a day, literally hours a day in the Bible, reading the New Testament 3 or 4 times, the Old Testament. And so 3 months later, honestly, I felt a very clear call to become a pastor. And I hadn't really gotten involved in church yet. So it had happened by then, but just barely. So how that worked was there was a little, very Bible believing sweet little Methodist church in town that was putting on a youth musical called Show Me Jesus by Jimmy and Carol Owens in the early 70s kind of thing. And they were going to do a choir tour with a backup band to different churches all throughout the region. And they needed a trumpet player. And so they called the high school orchestra director to ask for a couple of trumpet players. And so my buddy David and I got to be a part of that. And so this was my first foray into church life. And those people, I was a brand new believer, and they could tell that I was. And so some of the leaders in that youth group and some of the parents in that church just enveloped me just with love and care, and took me under their wing and began to nurture and disciple me. And they taught me the word. They had me in their homes. They're teaching me just basic life skills in a healthy family. And it was transformative, truly. But really, I knew that God was calling me to be a pastor. Now my brother had done really well in science and he went to the National Science Fair, did very well in physics, and had gotten a wonderful scholarship to an Ivy League school. And I was going to follow him to an Ivy League school and major in counseling because I loved listening to people and
Psychology and all of
yeah,
that.
just the counseling, the care for people's souls. And God said, Steve, that's great. We're going to use that in the church and as a pastor. So I felt that calling wasn't to preach, but to be a pastor, of which preaching is a part. It's a section of that. But I love the pastoral care. I love the hospital visitation. I enjoy the administration and planning and all that. But I just wanted to shepherd a flock. And it was just a humbling joy to my heart that God would invite me to do something like that and call me to do something. So, and then, oddly enough, I had no idea how do you get trained to do such a thing? What do you do? And so, I looked around at state schools, Ohio State, Western University. I looked at some of the Ivy League schools and their religion departments, and it was all very liberal theologically. It was professors that were teaching that this book that I loved and cherished was full of myths and legends and made up stuff written by men. And I'm thinking, I'm not going to spend 4 years sitting under someone who defames this holy book that is the Word of God that has changed my life. And so I'd never heard of Christian schools or seminaries, didn't know they existed. And so I literally had no idea what to do for college, for training for the pastorate. So I went to my church and said, I'm postponing future education until God shows me what to do. And so they said, well, what about missions? Okay. So I don't know if they decided how far away could they afford to send me or what, but they sent me for a year to Costa Rica to work at an orphanage called Roble Alto, which was an amazing experience. Which it's an orphanage that is still there to this day. In fact, it's a model orphanage for the entire Latin and South American countries. They send people to get trained in how they do orphanages there at Roble Alto. It's really a
Wow.
remarkable place.
And you got to take a group back.
I've gone. Yeah, it took 40 years, but I took 2 mission trips back just a handful of years ago, and it of course has grown and developed. But it's become nationally known in that it's the largest. They to feed these orphans, they decided to start a chicken hatchery. To feed the chickens, they decided to start a grain ministry, a farming grain thing with bins and silos and stuff. And they're now the largest producer of eggs in Costa Rica.
Oh my
So, but the
goodness.
reputation has grown nationally to where when I took the first trip back to Costa Rica to work at the orphanage, I got there a day early, and I arrived at the airport, and this taxi guy asked where I wanted to go, and I said, "Well, I'm meeting a group, but I want to go to this." Up above Heredia, this orphanage called Roble Alto. And just, Roble Alto, we love Roble. Thinking the guy at the airport knows about a little orphanage an hour and a half out of San Jose. How's that even possible? But it's an amazing thing. So, but that ties into my going to a Christian college. So before I left, I had to fly out of Newark, New Jersey. And because Parkersburg, oddly enough, doesn't have an international airport. Who knew? I know. So there was an older couple in my church, Einar and Emily Basinger, a really sweet couple that were itinerant evangelists. They would travel around to different smaller churches and hold revivals, and they would sing as a couple, beautiful voices. She played the auto harp, and he would preach. Just and they lived so humbly, so meagerly, just living their life for God. Never had kids, and really remarkable people. But they had been waiting. They're going to a conference in New Jersey, and they were waiting for the opportunity to drive me from Parkersburg to New Jersey to fly out with really, I think, the vice president of the missions agency to go to Costa Rica. So I got to be their captive audience in the back of their car for like 7 hours across the Appalachian Mountains. And all that whole time, they told me about Christian schools, and which I didn't know existed. I'm thinking, what? how does this dark, evil world allow something like that even to exist? I was really stunned. And it turns out they were graduates of Wheaton in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and were personal friends of Billy and Ruth Graham. Einar sang in a quartet with who was is it Cliff Barrow, who was the choir director for the Billy Graham Crusades. So they know these people, and so I was really amazed, but I really fell in love immediately with the idea of going to a Christian college. And so I applied to several from Costa Rica and was accepted to Wheaton. And so I redirected my flight home through Chicago to be able to visit the campus and have an interview and that kind of thing. But so I got to go to Wheaton, which was wonderful. My mom was upset, we'll just say, really upset that I'd become a Christian, then called to be a pastor, then going to a Christian college and not to an Ivy League school. And so there were lots and lots of debates and difficult conversations. But my mom wasn't coming at this from a Christian perspective. I was doing something that was now opposed to her values and things at the time. But in the process of all this, I got to live out my faith in front of my parents. And when I turned 18, just to kind of backtrack a little bit, I reestablished contact with my dad. So after the divorce, and lost visitation rights, he was so distraught at what he had done that cost him his family. I mean, genuinely distraught, that he decided to head back out of town to go recommit himself to the mental institution, to that horror of a place. So that shows you the depth of despair that he was in. So he's driving out of town and he passes.
Like maybe partly the need to like pay for what he did. You think some level?
No, I think I appreciate that. I really think it was more all that he knew that would be a home.
Yeah.
A place where he could get some care, perhaps. I don't know. But he didn't make it far because he was driving out of town on Route 50 and he passed by the little church where our Boy Scout troop had met. But again, we didn't attend there. We just met in a little side building. And he just decided to stop in this early Saturday morning. And in the basement of that church was the pastor and his wife, wonderful people, and the scoutmaster and his wife, strong.
Just hanging out on a Saturday morning.
No, they actually had heard what happened with my dad, what he had done, which was horrible, and the divorce and loss of visitation rights, lost his kids, and they gathered, just the four of them, to pray for him. They knew
No
him,
way.
and
They just happened to be in I forgot that. The basement of that church.
Correct.
Praying for your dad.
Yep. So he walks in, and they lead him to Christ, and he never goes back to the mental institution. His life is entirely changed, and so I got to meet him now as a fellow Christian. I didn't know that had happened, this 5 or 6 years prior, but it had been that long since I'd had regular contact with him, and so we now are sharing this common bond in Christ. Me off to college, and him as a new believer. He's living out of town where his parents had lived, and it was a remarkable thing to walk through the beginnings of his new faith. He continued to struggle emotionally. He was diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic. He was diagnosed or declared by the courts as unemployable. So he could have gotten a job, but he decided, well, if you're going to say that I'm unemployable, then I'll just be unemployed, and lived on disability and Social Security, and made a living for himself, that kind of thing. But he struggled deeply emotionally, and maybe the most of all struggled with forgiving himself. He understood the forgiveness of God. He truly did. But he could not forgive himself. And he and I would talk for hours, multiple times, about that forgiveness extends even to the things that we regret the most that we've done, even those things that we're the most ashamed of, the most, we feel like we've inflicted the most hurt and wounding. God even forgives that. And yet, to his dying day, he never really fully grasped and was able to embrace the forgiveness of God for what he'd done until, and I really, it might sound morbid, but I actually waited for the day when he would leave this earthly life and go to heaven, because I knew in that moment he would know the full forgiveness of God, and that he would be released of that burden finally, as would my mom, when she's still alive, but she would also be released just to experience the complete and utter healing of God, of the things we've done in our fallenness. And my dad is fully healed and fully restored. But it was a pain and a brokenness that he carried with him all of his life. But that's over now for him. So,
What happened to your mom?
It took 20 years, lots of prayer, lots of conversations, but the day came about 20 years later in a conversation. We were living in North Carolina. You were little kids. I was an associate pastor at a church in Durham. My mom was visiting, and I was driving her back across the Appalachians to Parkersburg, and she gave her life to Christ, just was ready. And so she forsook all those other things and embraced following Jesus. She struggled with church, didn't attend much, had a hard time finding a church she felt comfortable in, but she found forgiveness and grace in Christ. And so she turned 90 a couple months ago, and we share that wonderful common bond, that deep faith together, which is a great joy to my heart. So in going to Wheaton, of course, I came from this poor background where neither of my parents could give me $5, and Wheaton's, a top Christian school and expensive. And what do you do? except God did what God did, which is when I got back from Costa Rica and was accepted at Wheaton, there were 3 men in my church, 3 businessmen.
Was one the mortician?
Yes, one owned a funeral home.
And you worked there?
Worked there for a summer, yeah. Interesting side story, just to chase that a
Let's
moment.
go.
But I didn't drive. I had a bicycle that I rode all over town. You could ride over our little town, be anywhere in the whole town in half an hour by bike, and it was just the freedom to go to the city park or to the high school or wherever you wanted to go. But I'm working at a funeral home, and of course, there's funerals and there's processionals to the gravesite, and then there's this driving that's involved there. And I was a night watchman and a doorman, that kind of thing.
Night watchman meaning you would guard the bodies.
I guarded the bodies. That's right. Got to sort of be trained in the process of embalming, not licensed, but learned about
I
it.
have to add a side story. We do a lot of road trips as a family, and I will never forget the day Dad added a very secret special stop to our road trip, and it was a surprise. And he was like a kid in a candy store. He was so excited, and he drove us straight into the parking lot of a funeral museum. And it really was like Willy Wonka, like walking through, and this happens, and then you do this, and this is what that looks like. It was great.
The process of embalming is for another podcast, I suppose. Anyway, so the funeral director, who was a wonderful, godly man, said, "Steve, I need you to drive the flower van to ahead of the funeral and get all the flowers set up at the burial site." I said, I don't drive. And he said, "What? You need to learn to drive." So I practiced in the family car and stuff. And when it was time to take the driving test, you had to go out to the county sheriff, the state sheriff, anyway, so wherever that is out of town. And the only vehicle that day that was available was the hearse. So I drove the hearse out to the testing place, and out walks this deputy. And he sees this hearse, and he's walking around the perimeter of this hearse. He's looking in the windows, making sure that's empty. There's not a body, a casket inside. And let me just say, it was the quickest driving test I think ever in the history of driving tests. He wanted out of that car so fast. I passed. It was pretty funny.
There you go.
Also,
and you're a good driver. I can attest to that.
Parallel parking. If you learn to do that with a hearse, you've mastered parallel parking. But anyway, the funeral director and a couple of other businessmen in my church sat me down and said, "Steve, we just know you're called to be a pastor, and we really believe in you and see your character," which was humbling to hear. And they said, "Listen, when you get all the grants and help you can, we're paying the rest." And they did. So back then, there was a lot of help. There was, if you were poor, there was something called the Basic Education Opportunity Grant, and that helped a lot. But there's also a church I didn't know about, but it had a fund, an endowment fund for high school students wanting to enter the ministry. And it was even a different denomination. And so I applied for that, and that was a huge help, and got a little bit of Social Security benefits from my dad's disability. And then the remainder, which was not a small amount, these three men paid. And so I went through Wheaton debt-free, and then Wheaton grad school debt-free. Just the abundant grace of God, of His provision for a kid out of West Virginia that wanted to serve the Lord. So,
and yet you still had to find your own way to and from home.
Yeah, hitchhiking. So yeah, it's great. Back then you could actually hitchhike. I had a Peugeot PX10 that I liked, and I rode that a couple of times from Chicago to West Virginia.
Your bike.
My bike, yeah.
You would ride your bike.
Yeah, pannier bags and sleeping bag and tent and all that. But also you could hitchhike, and it was relatively safe. So I had a gym. I could have my entire summer belongings in a gym bag, and just stick your thumb out on, not on highways, not interstates, but on state roads, and get to Parkersburg. Yeah, absolutely. So
what a wild time. Times have changed.
Yes, they have, for the better in that way, for sure.
Oh, really? I kind of still wish we could hitchhike. Maybe not.
No, not.
Okay.
So yeah, want to hear more?
Yeah, let's go.
So I graduated from Wheaton with my undergrad, and then the master's, which I didn't quite finish because I felt called to. Well, how that worked was, as I was about to graduate, I was looking at seminaries and their curricula and what courses they offered, and this has changed a lot. But back then, seminaries didn't seem to offer much at all in the way of evangelism and discipleship. And I thought, a pastor of all people I don't know how to lead somebody to Jesus and help them grow in their newfound faith. That seems like a very central part of what you do.
Base level.
Yeah. So, I mean, they had wonderful courses on preaching and on theology and on Bible exposition and lots of stuff about that, but there wasn't anything on evangelism and discipleship. And I thought, okay, where do you learn that? Who does that well? And so in college, I'd been involved in both the Navigators Some and Campus Crusade. There was also an intervarsity group.
Now called Crew.
Yeah, that's right. Campus Crusade for Christ, now called Crew. And so
We don't crusade anymore.
it was still a great time.
Yeah,
Anyway,
just
so you're right. That's true. I postponed seminary for 5 years and said, Lord, let me just take a break and have a little parenthesis of training in these important ministry skills. So I joined staff with Campus Crusade, now called Crew, and they sent me to Ohio State, God also, which was one of their training centers for new staff that they thought had leadership potential. Don't know what they saw, but nonetheless. And it was there that I met my lovely wife, Jan. She was from Alabama. She became a Christian in college through the ministry of Crew at University of Alabama, and also had joined staff. And they sent us both, along with 20 other new staff, to Ohio State to be trained by experienced people.
And she was a sorority girl, and Dad was this poor boy with like 2 sweatshirts.
That's right. I had, holes in jackets and stuff like that. Yeah. Which is more in style today. I don't know. Who knew?
You're ahead of your time.
It was not in style then.
Trendsetter, Dad.
That's right. So, but we met and we went on our first date and we decided we didn't like each other. It was great.
There's a lesson in that.
She's very sociable, very outgoing in a beautiful way. She was a sorority girl, and I was very shy. I was very quiet, which is just the humor of God that He would call me to preach every Sunday, get up in front of people. But my nature really is almost hermit-ish. It really is. But I trust God for His empowerment to do what He calls me to do, and I find great joy in it. But it's contrary to my personality. Nonetheless, so we met, and I literally thought this is not for each other, and so we kind of casually dated other people for the next 3 or 4 months, and we met up again on a date because we're assigned to the same campus. We're doing ministry at Ohio State and seeing each other, and we went to a staff retreat up in Michigan at a ski resort, and I'd never skied in my life. Again, fairly poor, and but we were there, and Jan, I think, had skied maybe once, but we were on a casual date with other people. I was going on a date with a girl that from New England that was a very good skier, and Jan was on a date casually with a guy from Vermont where there's wonderful skiing, but it wasn't good enough for him. He went to better skiing, in his mind at least, in Utah, so they were way, way beyond us, and they quickly paired up and left us in the dust. So it's Jan and I. Basically, I'm trying to master the bunny slope and snow plowing and stuff, and then grabbing the rope as it yanks you back up the bunny slope. And finally, we graduated from that to an actual ski lift. And we had lots of foibles. I won't tell the whole story, but I couldn't figure out how to get off this ski lift safely and make the turn. And finally, I had enough practice that I was able to do that. And so Jan was sort of at this point kind of teasing with me a little bit and flirting a bit. And she just, as we're getting off, bumped me a little bit. And you had to turn right, otherwise there was a snow fence there. And then past that was an embankment about 25 feet down. It's all covered in snow and stuff, but it's a pretty good drop. So you had to turn right, otherwise you hit that. So anyway, she bumped me and I lost my balance, and I'm going straight, not right. I can't figure out how to turn. And then the next chair hits me in the back of the head and propels me over that fence and down that embankment. And they had to call the ski patrol and rescue me. But that was the day that I fell head over heels in love with Jan.
Yeah, it's so cute.
Yep.
That's one of the Nutter family greats.
Nutter lore.
Love that story. Nutter lore. Yes. Yeah, we'll get Jan on here to tell her side of the story too.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so after 5 years of ministry with Crusade Crew, I felt like it was time to go into seminary. And by then we were married and having little girls, and thrilled with that. And life took great, beautiful turns. Just the joy of being married and having my own children and raising them for Jesus has been just the greatest joy and ministry of my life. It really has been. So that's my story.
That's your story. I have 1,000 questions. I'm not going to ask all of them. But one, now that you're talking about me, I find it really interesting because I know that you originally did not want children. And that was almost a deal breaker for you and mom. What was that like? Why'd you change your mind?
Yeah, I was stupid.
Oh, okay.
So that's the short
Classic.
answer. The longer answer is, so I became a Christian in 1972, and it was about that time that Hal Lindsey's book, The Great Late Planet Earth, came out. And then following that, which was a blockbuster, sold millions of copies, and I just ate it up and read it several times. But it's dealing with end times prophecy and the start of the 7-year tribulation period, the Great Tribulation, and the Antichrist, and the false prophet, and the 10-nation confederation. And if you're
That's
involved
not going to be confusing for our audience at all.
right, so a lot of stuff about how the world ends.
Theoretically
Right,
ends.
it's a particular viewpoint of theology, and called anyway.
It doesn't matter.
Right, so
the world will end one day somehow. And Dad got freaked out by some of the theories.
right, and I bought that book and read it, and bought several other books on end times prophecy, and some of it is informative and some of it fairly hysterical in terms of almost fear mongering, if you will.
That's a great word.
But it was a very passionate thing, and I became very engrossed in it and very passionate about it. And I thought, the world is just so evil. How could you bring kids into a world that is evil? And if these things are unfolding now, why would I want to put young kids through that?
Yeah.
And so it just was very shallow thinking on my part, and God delivered me of that. So thankfully.
And I like that my mom, she was right.
She was absolutely right. Of course. Not the last time.
No, not the only time, not the last time.
Yep.
Oh, man. Okay. Now, one of my other questions is, you have had some really interesting ministry experiences since going into ministry as a pastor. We don't have to unpack every single one, but what are some of the standouts of just like crazy things that you've either walked through or had to walk people through that there's just no way you could have predicted any of that?
Yeah, there have been some, and I, again, don't know that my experience is unique
every
among
pastor
pastors or churches.
or every therapist or every counselor, anyone who's walking with people through stuff is going to have their own list. I just think yours, there you got some good ones.
Yeah, I would preface it by saying that some of these stories exhibit brokenness, and brokenness is something, honestly, that we all get to claim.
Yeah.
I'm broken. I'm a fallen human being in a fallen world, and I'm broken in multiple ways. We all are. And God takes us through the process of helping us heal and grow and mature as human beings and as followers of Jesus. And that's a lifelong process that he doesn't even complete in this lifetime. He completes that when we meet him in heaven one day, and that will be glorious. But in the meantime, we suffer and struggle with our brokenness in various ways. And so some of these stories are a reflection of brokenness in people's lives. Not all of them, but some. But so the first one that comes to mind was when I was in North Carolina. I'd been there for about a year, and I walked into the church one Monday morning when it was surrounded by and filled up with sheriff's deputies who were checking for bugs, wiretapping or whatever. And I thought, okay, this is an unusual start to my week. What's going on? I don't know. But it turned out, it turned out that the pastor at the time had an affair with a lady in the church, a wife of somebody else. And then somebody else, a third party, had secretly taped their salacious phone calls, and had made recordings of those, and then mailed those recordings to the pastor and to his wife, to this other lady and her husband, and saying, unless the pastor steps down in the next 2 weeks, this is going to the newspapers and the TV stations to be publicized. So kind of blackmail. So you have an affair, and then blackmail. So you have all kinds of parties brokenly acting, right, doing bad things. So I remember I walked in, and the pastor took me to the little boardroom meeting room area, just me and him. And he said, "Steve, what do you know about taping phone calls?" And I said, Actually, my VCR still blinks 12 o'clock, so I don't know much. I don't know anything about electronics at all, and I didn't. I still don't. So there was safety in ignorance there, which was nice to know. But because it certainly wasn't me, and we never found out who. But um, he wanted to stay, and he'd helped the church grow quite a bit in the couple of years he'd
He's a
been
real
there.
gregarious
Very
guy.
outgoing, very energetic, a great preacher,
Yeah.
but not a moral man.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to stay, and I remember him saying, "Steve, I'm probably going to choose to stay, and you may not want to." And I thought, wait. I didn't do anything wrong here, but I might have to leave. I don't know how that works. Let's back up and rewind. That doesn't seem
The math
right.
ain't mathing is what they say
Yeah,
these days,
right.
Dad.
So we were he called, and the older folks, especially in the church, loved and adored him because their church had been dying over the last several years, and he'd really helped reinvigorate it, and it had doubled in size, and was growing, and he was becoming well known in the community, and they were just loving what his
It felt
ministry was
like a
all.
breath of fresh
It
air to
really
them.
did. It was just
Yeah.
the rescue of this church, and now it was all falling apart. And so they had a meeting, and they offered. They said, "Well, you need to take a sabbatical. Take 3 months of a sabbatical." He had said that this all had happened. It was a 9-month affair. He said it had happened because of burnout. And so the church, these older folks are feeling bad that they'd been.
Pushed him to burnout.
Yeah, they were the instigators of his burnout, therefore the cause of the problem. So they were blaming themselves, and he was allowing that to happen. And so they were giving him the gift of a 3-month sabbatical as a reward for the affair.
For his gaslighting.
Yeah. So obviously, one of the other deacons looked at me. We knew this couldn't go this way, and so I said, "Well, let's turn to Second Timothy or First Timothy 3." And
Was this in a board meeting?
no, this was about 50 people.
But it feels very 12 Angry Men.
Yeah, kind of. I guess so. But it was the leaders and the very committed families of the church that had been in the church for 50 years.
So big but small group of insiders.
Correct.
Yeah.
But it was about a third of the church that was
Okay.
there, a fourth. And so I turned to the scriptures to talk about what are the qualifications for spiritual leadership. And I read about how it says husband of one wife and managing your household well and those kinds of things. And that, you don't just automatically step into those qualities. It takes a long time for God to build those qualities of a faithful track record of those things in your life. And so if you've then done things that have broken that, it certainly takes a while to reestablish a track record of faithfulness. You just can't take a vacation for 3 months and think all is well. And so he really needed to be out of the ministry for at least a good couple of years. And in some people's minds, maybe a permanent disqualification for what he had done. But at minimum, you can't just take a sabbatical, write a book, and come back and be in the pulpit again. And so in the end, that group agreed with me because that's what the scripture plainly says. And so we offered and provided 6 months of full salary, provided counseling and accountability and stuff. And it just was a difficult chapter. Somebody asked me if I would consider being the next head pastor. And I said, I'm very honored, but you don't want me. I can't really fulfill that role of a shepherd for some of these older folks that I love dearly, but I've broken their heart by being a part of having the head pastor that they love have to leave. So I'm sort of the culprit for him leaving the ministry, which means there's going to be a barrier in terms of them receiving pastoral care or teaching from me. And they're really better off with a fresh start. So I stayed around 2 or 3 more years and as associate pastor, and they brought in a wonderful, godly man who was a great healer of that church. And it was wonderful to see that take place. And then in 1994, we felt called to come to Irving, and God opened up the position here. Been here 32 years and have loved serving CBC. And just a couple quick stories there.
Yeah. Before we do, I want to linger on that for a second. Because I think that since then, there's been in the news and things like that, a lot of stories of pastors failing or falling for different moral or character issues. And, well, I want to back up and just say one of the things that I remember as a kid, because I remember this story, and I was younger than 3rd grade because we moved here when I was halfway through 3rd grade. So I had to have been in kindergarten, first grade, and yet somehow I really remember this unfolding. It was just it took up a lot of space in our world, and I'm really grateful. I'm really grateful for that though, because here's what I got to see. As a kid, this was the impression that I had of how you handled that.
Hmm.
It was, you could have taken the "how dare he, I'm holier than thou, that would never happen to me, I can't believe he did that" approach. And instead, your posture was, "There, but for the grace of God go I. If it could happen to him, it could happen to me. How do I create safeguards in my life to protect my ministry, to protect my marriage, to protect the flock, and anyone, and even both, not even just from you doing those things, but from any insinuation that that would have happened, even out of slander." And so I was really impressed by that, because it taught me what that taught me as a kid from early on is I'm not immune. If my dad could come through with this posture of this could happen to me, I'm just as human and just as capable of these things, and I'm no better really. It's the safeguards that we put in place and the boundaries that we put in place to protect our obedience, right? Anyway, do you remember the process that you went through, and how you got to that posture?
Yeah. Let me first mention about the saying that you gave, which I like that saying, there, but the grace of God go I. But for me personally,
Yeah,
I've kind of turned that on its head.
love it.
I see it a little differently.
Okay.
I really come to conclude, actually, there go I. Thank you, God, for your grace. Because that man's no more sinful or broken or wounded than I am. His sin was made public, but I'm just as much a sinful person and as fallen as that man or anybody else, or the pastors you hear about on TV, or other people that do horrendous things. Because I'm entirely fallen. We all are. So it's just God's grace. It's God's grace that forgives, that covers, that heals, that delivers. And so I bask in that forgiveness. So not just mine, but other people in that church, our heart went out to the family, and how do we try to care well for them? Um, and they received that some and rejected that some, but we did what we could do. We also thought about how do we care well for the flock, and so I think having an interim pastor come in was really helpful. I had calls and visits from other churches saying, Steve, you're in a precarious situation there. Why don't you come join our staff? Why don't you, or a church would say, we'd like to call you to kind of get you out of that to come be their pastor. And I had to turn those down, because I don't know how you leave a flock in the midst of that crisis, in the midst of that pain, because it's family. If it's family, so
Yeah, they're hurting.
yeah, of course. So you can't just abandon them in the midst
Yeah,
of
you want
that.
to see them
So,
across the finish line of at least like making it out of survival mode.
but even before that happened, I had made some very clear decisions about um, boundaries and protective measures I would take to not put myself in. There's temptation plenty anyway, so why put yourself in more tempting situations? Why not have some accountability to just have a safeguard? And so some people call this the Billy Graham rule, but one of those is that I'm never alone in the church with a female or child, that kind of thing. I've always make sure that somebody else is here. It's been older ladies that have actually come and sat in the outer office and babysat, as I'm counseling somebody. They bring knitting or a book or something.
Which I actually really love, because I think, I don't know what the Billy Graham principle would strictly say, but I think there are some people who Billy Graham would also not be alone with a woman and things like that. And I think there are some people who would apply that so strictly that the pendulum swings into, I can never speak to a woman. And I have to cut off all female friendships and relationships. And I think you have struck a really cool balance of, you still offer counsel and care to women, but within a certain environment.
Right. And right, because uh, I mean, as humans, we need an avenue to unburden our souls, to share hurt. We need a safe place to to reveal our inner struggles. And so I want to be that for whomever, young, old, male, female, whoever. I really want to be that for them. But it does mean that I need to do that in a way where, if somebody drives up to our parking lot and they see, oh, there's Pastor Steve's car and there's this lady's car. Oh, it's just those two. They're here alone. Even if everything is totally platonic and above board, it gives the appearance of impropriety. It gives the occasion for that person to wonder. It sows doubt. Could there be something happening there? It never crosses their mind if there's 4 cars in the parking lot, if there's, several people inside the building. So you know, I, I just I just try to be very careful about that.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I'm a very hands-on type pastor in that we're a very hugging church, and so as I greet people as they leave, I'm giving hugs to guys and their wives and little kids and stuff because I believe in the value of human touch, and I think we've become so afraid of that
So
in our
fragile.
culture that
Mm-hmm.
it's almost become a sterilized kind of existence. And man, if there ought to be a safe place to just be genuinely hugged and loved and embraced. It ought to be the church. It ought to be the family of God. So I fight for that. I flat out fight for that.
I love that. You give great hugs, Dad.
Thanks. You're an easy one to hug. So
Thanks.
there.
All right. Do you want to keep telling stories?
Sure. What kind of story do you want now?
Well, yeah.
A couple of sort of
You
church.
got, yeah.
So one was about the church I'm a pastor at now, and I've been again for 32 years. So this has been really my life ministry. My wife's in my boat, and she's been an amazing partner in ministry, and brings passion and skill that is way beyond me. It's just remarkable. God's blessing of a wonderful wife uh, and co-laborer in the work that God calls us to do, and then daughters that love ministry as well, which has just been remarkable to us. But so we had a crisis that happened maybe 25, 26 years ago, where a family lost a couple of children. They were teenagers, and it was a mysterious kind of death where the city health department, the county got involved, and it was never really quite figured out what happened. But it became a national news story where this family was bombarded with wanting interviews and accusations and all kinds of things. And so we set up a kind of a crisis media team, if you will, and let somebody handle the media. And I just wanted to really focus on caring for the family. And it was just a wonderful opportunity to see the family of God gather around this very wounded and hurting family who had 5 kids and now 2 were gone, and to just love on them and care for them and be there in the midst of their grief. And there were also times, there weren't many of these. There's a couple of occasions where I needed to defend the family publicly. I remember I was listening to one of my favorite talk show stations, and a guy that I love listening to. And somehow this story was on the news a lot. And so, what happened to these kids, kind of mystery. And so he was thinking it was something nefarious. And
He
so,
was conspiracy
right.
theorying.
So I remember turning around and I drove to the station.
No
I
way.
did.
I don't remember this. You drove
Yeah.
there?
So, yeah, it's just I'm normally a calm and just let things go type, but
Unless
once in
the
a
people
while,
you love are
that's
in
right, exactly.
trouble.
Something about shepherding,
Kicks in.
So anyway,
Superhero.
I beat on their door, and the who's the engineer came out and said, or the producer, and I said, "Hi, I'm the pastor of the family he's just talking about. Can I speak with him?" So they put me on the air, and I just explained. He asked whatever questions you want. It's wide open to take your shots. But this family is a wonderful, loving family, and they're being misjudged and maligned publicly. And I'm here to set the record straight.
Let's
So
go.
anyway, so that was a.
I like that about you. Maybe that's, I think, hopefully that's where I get some of my spice from.
I don't know. Another one was there was a small church in the area that had been an offshoot of another larger church, and it had gotten out of balance in a lot of ways, and the pastor did some things that were not good.
Let's be a little, can we be more specific?
I don't know that I can, honestly.
Okay.
That's not my story to tell.
Yeah.
What is my story? My part of the story to tell is some of the people from that church began filtering their way to our church, and we began to.
I mean specific, and would you say that church had eventually disintegrated into like a cult type
I
environment.
don't
Would
know
you
that I
say
would
that?
use that term.
Okay.
Um,
But it was unhealthy. The
it
dynamics in the
wasn't
church
healthy.
were
So
unhealthy.
um, you define a cult as sort of either a theological or behavioral offshoot of
Mhm.
a main group. So Hinduism has a cult off of it. I mean, I'm sure several, but one that would be Hare Krishna. That's an
Mhm.
offshoot cult that's deviated from the essence of Hinduism with some very specific things. And so there's groups that are cults or sects off of Christianity or any other group. And um, some of those become behavioral issues that deviate. Some of those become theological issues that are different or whatever. But this particular pastor was well trained, expert in Greek and Hebrew, excellent teacher, but he had a very dominating kind of way about himself and then some behavioral things. So that got to the extent of people beginning to leave and be very wounded, and we got to start caring for some of those people. And I won't go into the whole story again, not my story to tell, except that the time came where that pastor was put on trial, and rightly so. And I was called upon to testify about the power of spiritual abuse from how a pastor can inflict coercion or abuse upon members of the congregation and use that position of influence or that office, if you will, in an untoward way that can do harm to other people. And he was very abusive in that way, and so he ended up going to prison for a decade for what he did because not just the behavior, but using the position in the way that he did. And so it was a very difficult and painful time for all involved. But out of that, others in that church, that little group, noticed that people in our church just loved on them well, and they'd known them from when they were part of the original larger church. And after all these years, they were coming back and reuniting, and I just got to see the beauty of the family of God
Yeah.
unfold in tangible ways of loving these people so tenderly, so caringly that those people became many of them part of our church and grew to become leaders in our church, and which I consider to be, it's not my doing by any stretch, but if I were to pick one thing that, boy, I thank God for the privilege of being a part of that in some way, that would be it. Seeing that level of healing, that level of restoration is the most meaningful thing that's happened in all my years of ministry. So I'm grateful for that.
It's very beautiful and
It is a
powerful.
beautiful story.
Maybe we'll get some of them to tell their
Yeah.
story. We'll
It's
see.
a powerful story.
It is a powerful story. That actually brings me back to a question I was meaning to ask earlier, but I'm really glad that you told that story so I could ask it even more robustly,
Hmm?
which is, we hear a lot of stories of moral failings or even wolves in sheep clothing or spiritual abuse with positions of power, things like that. Um, what, how is that different from the Jesus that you know?
Good question. It is entirely different, but I would say, as I've shared some of those stories, and those are the things that make the news. But the overwhelming majority, 99% of pastors and leaders of churches, are wonderful people who don't do these things. They're really seeking with all their heart to be surrendered to Christ and live lives of integrity and to care for people well. So these are anomalies. These are abnormal things that happen here or there, and they make the news and they have an impact in people's lives, a devastating impact. That's true, but it's not the norm. It is genuinely not the norm. Um, the whole church grieves. I mean, when some famous pastor in Florida or California does something, I grieve because it brings a stain upon the church at large. Not that this church had any part in it, it didn't, but still the church of our Lord is shamed in some way, is publicly embarrassed in some way because of the behavior of some person. But that genuinely is not the norm. The vast majority are people that really want to just live for God and serve Him, and they do so with a pure heart. What was the question?
How is that different than like the Jesus you know, or even the church that you love?
Well, the Jesus that I know is the beautiful Jesus of the Bible, and the Jesus that is portrayed there, and the Jesus that I know personally that I talk to every day is is um, is humble and full of grace. He's just and righteous. He's um, he's perfect in every way. He he welcomes with open arms all who come to him by faith, and his his what appears to be his greatest passion is redemption, is redeeming people back to himself. In our brokenness, in our woundedness, in all of our fallenness, that's why he came. That's why he came 2,000 years ago to die on the cross and rise again, is because he wants to reconcile us to himself, reconcile us to the Father. And that beautiful story of redemption is such a powerful portrayal of the heart of God. It's something we'll never fully grasp in this life. We'll understand it more on the other side of this life when we get to heaven, and to see Jesus in all of his beauty and his perfection. But the Jesus that I know knew even then, 2,000 years ago, that we would create all this mess. He did. He knew every shortcoming, every failure, and he came anyway. It's just the most remarkable thing. He actually, knowing who we are in the deepest part of our soul, came to redeem us nonetheless, which is just amazing to me, that he would love us so perfectly, unendingly, unwaveringly. And so the Jesus that I know and that I follow, that I ache to be like, I see myself so far short. I see myself in so many ways not being the man that he calls and he designed me to be. And none of us are the way that we want to be, but yet he places before us the privilege and the opportunity of growing to become more like him day by day if we yield and surrender. And that's the beauty of the Christian life, is in the midst of all my foibles and weaknesses and frailties, he's still working with this very rough stone, this very rough rock, and he's knocking off rough edges and filing away to help shape me to become more like him. And that kind of the level of care I find irresistible, just irresistible. Sorry.
I love it, Dad.
So
I'm grateful for your heart and your perspective. It's beautiful. What's the message for the person who may have been hurt by the church then, or has experienced some challenges along those lines?
I've thought about this a lot because I know people, and I've heard of people, some famous people, that have rejected Jesus and rejected the church because of some hurt. And that hurt is real. That hurt is genuine. We can inflict pain upon one another as broken, fallen human beings. We can. Um, and so I guess on the one hand, I'd want to say we readily admit we're not perfect. We're not. We still carry that brokenness, and we're not the people that we know God wants us to be. But we're in process. We're wanting to grow and be more like Jesus. But it's something that you won't see in me fully developed until I get to heaven or anybody else. So we know that we're broken. We know that we are not him. We're a a distant shadow, if you will, of Jesus in his perfection. But one day we'll be like him, and I find great glory and comfort and reassurance in that. The other thing I would say is, what do you? I don't know how to word this. On the one hand, I know that pastors and Christian leaders are upheld as an example, and that's understandable. And I really try to tell lots of stories about myself that knock me off that pedestal to just be a relatable human being. I'm just part of the church family. But I'm baffled by people who reject Jesus because of me or some other Christian leader. I mean, please don't base your eternal destiny upon my behavior. I mean, I promise I'll let you down. I guarantee you I will let you down. I don't want to, I don't intend to, but I know that I will. I know that I will let you down. Um, you placed your trust in the wrong object, in a very fallible, weak object. The only object worthy of your trust is Jesus himself. He's the one who came for you and loved you enough to die for you and rise again. And it's him that is the perfect life that we follow. And so if you've been wounded, it's because we're weak vessels, we're weak messengers of the one who is the real thing, the true living God. Trust him to love you perfectly. He absolutely will not, cannot, by nature cannot let you down. He's perfect in every way. So I guess I'd want to help people redirect where their frustration is at, because if they're looking to me, I know I will fail you. I'm human, but I know the one who's perfect, and he cannot fail.
I love that. Now, you've talked a lot about like you're human, you are broken. There is still sin at your core because we're human, and that's a very like theologically true statement. None of us are perfect. We're all afflicted still with this brokenness, and we won't experience that full healing till we get to heaven. And one of my favorite stories about you, and one of the most impactful things you've ever said to me that you don't even remember,
Sounds about like me.
is I think I was in high school. You've since heard the story, but you were driving me to school or somewhere. You were chauffeuring me, and you were singing one of your very Steve Nutter-esque made up songs about our dog. And just, yeah, lots of songs about the dog, about all of us. It's great. Steve-isms, dad-isms. It's great. Absolutely. And I have this memory of you in the car driving, and you're just kind of looking around, and then you look over at me and you just say with this like boyish simplicity, I love being me. I don't think you even remember saying that. I don't think you even remember that moment. But in that very second, it was like blinders removed, like, oh, I'm allowed to like myself. And this is at a very critical age of middle school and high school, and you don't like yourself, or you're constantly blowing up all your imperfections and minimizing all of your strengths, and your identity is just like this ball of mess as it's forming, and you're trying to find things to like about yourself, but you don't even know if you're allowed to. And that gave me such permission. Whether I was able to embrace it right that second, it just created a new mindset of like, that's the target, is being able to say, I really enjoy who I am. So, how's that different than like, oh, I'm a sinner, I'm still broken, and all that stuff? And why is that perspective also important to hold at the same time?
I really do uh, live in that reality.
I know you
I
do.
experience the brokenness and my flaws, but I try to live in the reality you're talking about there. And this one gets theological, but I'll be brief, but it really has to do with the image of God. That I genuinely believe, as the Bible teaches, that every single human being is made in the image of God. And so if we're actually made in the image of God, as mysterious and fascinating as that is, one thing is God likes us. He made us. He thought of us before we were ever formed in our mother's womb. He's given us his own. We're image bearers of God, where animals, plants, trees, rocks can't be. It's astounding. And so, how do I? I don't mean in a prideful way, but how do you not like and value what God made and declared is in His image? It's so, and then obviously I live out that image imperfectly. We've talked about that. I get that, but I think the other thing is He's for me. He's actually for me and for you and for whoever's watching. That he's on our side. He's designed us with this this master plan of the kind of person he knows we can be. And that means he's giving us deliberate thought to our lives and the path of our lives and the kind of character that we have and the things that we do and the things that we feel deeply about. It's part of his design. And so I do like me. And
Yeah.
not that I'm special. It's just that
Well, you are. We all are. Yeah.
I'm thrilled with the thought that God created me in my uniqueness and you in your uniqueness and everybody else in their uniqueness. It's from the mind of God. And so, yeah, I make up silly songs about our dog or my kids, and I have weird nicknames for everybody. And it's part of, maybe it's an outlet from a challenging childhood. I don't know, but I
It's fun.
express these things. It is fun for me. And God, I think, values that part of me, values all of that in me. So I'm grateful.
Well, I like you too, Dad.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Yeah. So would you say that sin is that posture that heart or parts of us that walk out of alignment with God's best for us even?
That's a good way to put that. It really is that he has a plan. He wants us to live in ways that honor and please him. And oftentimes we don't. And so in all those occasions where we don't, in thought, word, deed, motivation, attitude, whatever, we are living out of alignment of who Jesus is and who he calls us to be. And we can confess that and repent of that and trust God to empower us by his Spirit to walk in victory the next time and not fall back into those same patterns. And the fact that he's just at work in us like that is a beautiful thing, a powerful thing. And, oftentimes I'm following my own wishes, my own ways, but he's patient and gracious and forgiving. And the other thing is, again, this is a theological thing, but as fallen as we are, as followers of Jesus, we're actually clothed in the very righteousness of Christ, which is such a freeing truth. It doesn't free us to sin more. It frees us to understand the gift that God's given us, that he took our sin and placed it on Jesus, and that was placed on his account. He bore our sin, but he also placed Christ's righteousness in my account, in your account. And so what he sees is
like debt paid, student loans paid off, plus $1 million in your account.
He sees us adorned and immersed in the righteousness of his Son. And we will become that in heaven. But even now, that standing before him, before the throne of God, there's just not words for that.
There are not words. Let's leave it at that, Dad. Thanks for sharing.
It's my pleasure, Kristen.
I love talking to you. It's one of my favorite things to do.
It's a pleasure.
And we'll have you back if you'll have us.
Sure.
Thank y'all for tuning in to Another Perspective. Join us next time for some more great conversations. We did it.